Good morning, good morning, good morning. Or afternoon, I guess it's actually afternoon at this point. I am lost. Really just kind of out of it today. It is my oldest birth child's 25th birthday. And for some reason, for the last year, I had thought that their last birthday was their 25th birthday. And so I wish them a happy 26th birthday this morning. Hi, Kenny. I wish them a happy 26th birthday this morning. And they're like, Mom, I'm 25. And I'm like, fuck. I'm an idiot. I think some people are already here, so I probably shouldn't send this to them. I'm trying to make sure that I send to everybody, and I'm going to ask that everybody in here smash the screen as much as you possibly can, just because that puts us up in the algorithm a bit higher. And I'm trying to make sure that we stay up somewhat in the algorithm because it's been weird lately and it's been going down quite a bit, and I don't know why. So if you can share and like the video and comment. All the comments actually help. Um, uh, I'm working better at not being distracted by the comments, so they're not going to be as distracting to me. And I know that they actually help put us up in the algorithm. And like everybody else, I understand that I must be up in the algorithm to be seen. So we can get it up in the algorithm. That's always helpful. So the land bridge theory has been debunked on some levels. The fact that it existed and people came across is not what's been debunked. What's been debunked is that it's the first movement of people to the Turtle Island or Abiyala area. Our current knowledge is that people have been here since before the land bridge's ice-free corridor opened. So the land bridge theory or the Bering Strait theory or the Clovis First theory, these all very much tie into each other, states that so when the glacial maximums are in place, like when we're as heavily frosty as we can get, right? Our land masses shift, and it's not shift, change. And the way that they change isn't like they move place, but they get larger or smaller because of the sea levels. So, like some of the islands of the South Pacific and Australia were all one land mass. There is a continent that was fictional that they recently found the continent, and it was just that it was such a small island now because of the way that the glaciation of the planet had shifted things. So what happens is when the ice encases places, it sucks up all the water from the ocean, right? All those massive glaciers suck up all the water from the ocean. And so our sea level is lower. So when we are looking at the Bering Strait or the Bering Land Bridge, what we're looking at is during a mass glaciation time, it kind of became a large continent, right? And so they called it the continent of Beringia is what we're calling it. And it's understood that there were people living on that continent and there were animals living on that continent. And that during that time, people migrated to Turtle Island, North America. So the Bering Land Bridge theory, or the Bering Strait, or the Land Bridge theory, or the Clovis First theory state that during this time where there's this ice-free corridor in this area, so the continent is there, and there's spaces like on the European side and space, or the Eurasian side, and spaces on the Turtle Island side that are less. That are still land, right? And there's spaces that people and animals were kind of intermingling, but this ice-free corridor is kind of like from roughly the Bering Strait down, basically, where the Bering Strait is now. At least that's my understanding of it. And so that ice-free corridor was only open from 18 to 15,000 years ago. The Clovis first theory states that Clovis were the first people here, and Clovis are like 13,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago. They actually have DNA from the Clovis find that we have of a Clovis person. And so if you're using things like a GEDmatch, it will actually match your DNA to a Clovis person if you have DNA that matches that Clovis person, right? So current studies, and some of these are on the website, the widdaord.com website, under Turtle Island Indigenous Finds for Turtle Island Indigenous people. So the current understanding is that through different finds that we have, we know that people were here in Turtle Island and in Abiyala. Turtle Island is North America, if you don't know, and Abiyala is South America, if you don't know. Hi. There were people here in Turtle Island and here in Abiyala. DNA evidence states it's 51,000 years. That's the newest stuff. And that I do not have on my site. I'm still doing some studying on it. I will put up, I've got to grab the save thing that I have and put it up there. But current DNA study is stating that they think it's 52,000 years. Current physical evidence in archaeology shows that at 32,000 years ago, there was somebody in a cave in the southern tip of Mexico, which means that because of where it's at, that they had already been here for a hot minute. So they're saying roughly 35,000 years ago for that find. Or people being here based on that find. There is a bone. God, I can't remember what type of bone it is. I think it's horse with cut marks on it 27,000 years ago, a cave in the Yukon. The white sands footprints, there's still a lot of debate as to whether the white sands footprints are true. And there's been new evidence that points to maybe the way that they had tested the seeds in the white sands footprints might be wrong, not wrong testing, but might have given the wrong answer. And so it's leaning towards maybe not, but I don't know what to say on that one, just because of the fact that just because of that doesn't mean that it might not be even earlier, right? Like, and because they're testing a seed on a layer like above, it doesn't mean that, it wasn't already there when that seed came into play. But that one should, the white sands is like 23,000 years ago, and there's some debate right now into whether or not that exists. There is a find that's 130,000 years ago, but this would be a descendant of Homo erectus, another species which supports regional speciation or the multi-regional theory, yet still shows all Homo sapiens as having developed within Africa. So when we're looking at those finds predate the Bering Land Bridge's open passage to get from Asia to Turtle Island. And so when we look at that, these things debunk the Clovis first theory. They debunk the idea that the Bering Strait or the Bering Land Bridge is the way that people got here. Current thought process, there's studies being done on a South Pacific boat route, which many of us who are Indigenous and who have heard stories from elders kind of already knew, right? So these studies are really kind of doubling down on that. We now know that within Turtle Island Indigenous and Abiyali Indigenous DNA, that there is a 0.02% to 0.03% Denisovan DNA, which shows about 10,000 years spent with the Denisovans. And because of what they can pathway out through the DNA and through how the interbreeding between the species was, which shows us that they moved through the Denisovan area and that lower part of Eastern Eurasia. And in that movement through that lower part, the Denisovan DNA that we see in Eurasia is never at the top of Eurasia. It's at the bottom of Eurasia. It's in the southeast and in the islands of the South Pacific and in Australia. And so it shows this movement migration pattern along the bottom instead of along the top, right? So this is why they're looking at the southern boat route, and they have evidence that supports the southern boat route. And to me, it makes perfect sense as the islands of the South Pacific come and go. It's a volcanic ring. They call it the Ring of Fire. And because it's a volcanic ring and they call it the Ring of Fire, the islands of the South Pacific will create and disappear not constantly, but frequently. I've seen videos of islands appearing on YouTube in the South Pacific, right? These things happen And we know that, like when we look at certain groups in the Polynesian area or in the islands of the South, not Polynesian area, in the islands of the South Pacific, when we look at certain communities within the islands of the South Pacific, we state that these indigenous communities have only been there for like 2,500 years. This is what archaeology states. As an indigenous person going into archaeology, I asked, what the fuck do you mean by that? Like, how can you tell that they've only been there 2,500 years? And the reason that they state that those communities have only been there 2,500 years is because that's how long the island has been there. So it doesn't mean that they weren't there in other islands before, right? And that those islands haven't disappeared beneath the waves. And the continent that they're talking about that was a recent, oh, we discovered this fictional continent is actually there. Hi, we discovered this fictional continent is actually there. That continent is in the South Pacific as well. So the southern boat route to the South Pacific would probably be around, I would say 40,000 years ago, roughly, because of the fact that we take that 10,000 years of that Denisovan intermixing, right? Our admixture from the Denisovan. So when we move that southern boat route, it would be our earliest route here to Abayala first and then into Turtle Island. We see that Turtle Island indigenous people also have a ghost species, and Abayalan indigenous people also have a ghost species within them, which is fully supported by the Cerruti Macedon, which is that 130,000-year-old find I was just talking about. And that one's in San Diego. And so as we moved across the planet as Homo sapiens, we get all the admixture that we get because, and that's what we're talking about today, actually the species within us, because we enveloped all these other species who were really small by the time we mixed with them and by the time we met them. And that really has to come with how our species came about as a speciation compared to how we believe other species come about as a speciation, right? And so when we're looking at that admixture, we can track kind of the timeline of migration, and we can track kind of the route of migration, which puts the earliest route and the first route coming over as being the southern boat route. There is another idea of a route at 21,000 years ago, what we call the Kelp Highway, 21 to 25,000 years ago, I think is what it is. And this is along the northern edge of the Pacific Ocean. And this follows the northern coast along Eurasia and up across the Bering Land Bridge, Bering Strait area, or where the land bridge would have been, and which is currently now the Bering Strait, and down. So this one is between 21 and 25,000 years ago. We do know that the Japanese are, I've seen studies, and those I do not have on my site, but I've seen studies that talk about the Japanese having boats at 21, 25,000 years ago, like they're crossing the seas. We also know now that Homo erectus crossed water because of Homo florensis and because of Homo luzonensis and because of the ghost species in different areas. And we know that Neanderthal crossed water. So knowing that these two species were crossing water, there's an island in the Mediterranean that Neanderthal got to. So knowing that these two species are crossing water, the fact that they were crossing water before we're coming about really means that we were probably able to cross water on some feasible level anyways, because we're taking tools that they have and we're utilizing tools that they have and we're adapting tools that we have because we are adapting of our adaptations. That's like our species thing, one of them. So the northern boat route, we have evidence that there's boats at that point. The Kelp Highway, really, we logically have evidence that there's boats at the 35 to 40,000 years ago along the southern boat route as well. Yet we've had long accepted evidence of sailing or boat making in that time frame. So the Kelp Highway along the north would have been 21 to 25,000 years ago. And then there is thought process that there is still a crossover on the Bering Land Bridge and the open ice-free corridor during the 18 to 15,000 years ago. There's also understanding that that crossover is not necessarily this way. Part of it's this way. So the thought process now is that there were already people here in Turtle Island and Abayala from that southern boat route, roughly 30,000, 35, 40,000 years ago, and that northern boat route, the Kelp Highway, 21 to 25,000 years ago, that there's already people here in Abayala and Turtle Island, and that as Beringia opens up and becomes this kind of continent with this ice-free area in this continent, and this way for them to get through, that people are meeting in this space, and again, admixture are us. We really, really enjoy having sex with things that are unusual. We like new things. So, so when we are looking at the routes here to Turtle Island, we see that there are, and to Abiyala, we see that there are two routes here to Turtle Island and Abiyala. One to Abiyala from the south and one to Turtle Island from the north. That kind of made me flip people off, sorry. And those two routes that are here within Abiyala and within Turtle Island are actually giving us that space here, and that when the Beringia continent opens up and the ice-free corridor is there, that there is intermixing of the people in Northeast Asia and the people that are in Turtle Island in this space. The X1 mitochondrial DNA starts here in Turtle Island and then migrates back to Siberia. And so we see that in that space within, we see that intermix. People who are from Turtle Island and from Abiyala left the Levant area, the Arabian Peninsula area, before 50,000 years ago. At this time, everybody on this continent is, or on this planet, every species except for Neanderthal, which is still around, to our knowledge, is on the darker shade of skin. This is because of where Homo sapien develops in Africa. Homo sapien does come from Africa. We know that Homo sapien comes in Africa as a convergence of many different species. This proves a theoretical method of speciation in this last year. So, in the understanding that Homo sapien comes from a convergence of species within Africa, we also know that Homo sapiens starts out very dark of skin. The reason Homo sapiens starts out very dark of skin is because we all have melanin. Every single one of us. Melanin is what colors your eyes and what colors your skin. The only people who lack melanin are people who are albino. This is not albino. This isn't even what we would call Northern European white, right? This is not that. It is a lack, complete lack of melanation in your skin is what albino is. Everybody else has melanin in their skin. The level of melanin that you have in your skin depends on your position along the equator. So if you live in an area that's very sun heavy, that does not have a lot of shade, you have higher content of melanin in your skin. This comes from the time that you spend in utero. The time that the sun is shining down on your mother is actually a huge effector of what your skin tone will actually be. So at 50 something thousand years ago, as everybody is leaving the Saudi and Arabian, or the old names, new names, Arabian Peninsula, and moving across and up, we're seeing that most people are moving across the west or to the east first because of the fact that the ice is still covering the vast majority of Eurasia. And then as people are moving to the west and moving up north, we are seeing that everybody is darker skin. We don't start seeing lighter skin, lighter shaded skin until like 5,000 years ago, right? We don't really start seeing it become a lot of us until after that, or not even a lot of us, but over half of us until after that. We know that early Europeans, early Scandinavians are dark of skin and light of eyes, right? So that doesn't mean that if there's no category that you can put somebody's skin shade into, because everybody's shade of skin is pretty much roughly the same, and you don't give a shit about that because nobody taught you what othering was anyways, and nobody taught you what hate was anyways. You don't say this is black and this is white. And when you're all pretty much the same shade, who gives a flying anyways? So everybody moving into Abiyala and Turtle Island at the moment that they moved into Abiyala and Turtle Island was absolutely dark of skin. Absolutely. Whether or not everybody moving into Abiyala and Turtle Island as dark as skin was any other lighter or darker skin than the people moving into Europe at the time or the people moving into Asia at the time, all evidence points that it's the same skin scale. And I do always want to point out that this is a Neanderthal, right? And This Neanderthal, as you can see, is darker of skin than what we are currently associating Neanderthal as having on skin shade levels or sliding scale. We have shades that are darker and we have shades that are lighter. And the reasons that we have shades that are darker and shades that are lighter, again, have to do with the equator. We always must understand that even within those, there are ranges. It is not that everybody is the same. So when somebody says lighter, lighter could be much darker than your perception of what lighter is. And the reason that we need to remember those things is because as we're talking about these early groups of humans, and as we're talking about the way that all of these are moving across and the way that they're moving into space and becoming indigenous to space and really enveloping within that space, it's important to note that nobody cares and everybody's roughly the same, right? And we don't see as much of the differences. This is why we really envelop people within. So, are the people who arrive at Turtle Island and Alba Yala black at the time that they arrive, or what our brain considers having the shade of skin that is black, which is actually dark brown? Yes, absolutely. Are they African? No, without a doubt, no. They've already spent at least 10,000 years in Southeast Eurasia and in the islands of the South Pacific and in Australia. And there are indigenous Australians already in Australia when Turtle Island and Abayala and indigenous people are coming through that space, because indigenous Australians are 70,000 years in Australia. So when we're looking at this, we have to make sure that we understand that it is not about the categories that old white men trying to justify the atrocities that they were trying to commit and to continue committing created to make you think that somebody else is who to hate, instead of the government that's trying to kill you so that they can hoard from you and take from you, right? So, so actually, the amount of sun a mother gets does affect the baby's skin tone. That's actually new information that's been out within the last year. Uh, and there's other things that most people don't get. Look up the Sandra Lang case, where two white parents had a black baby in apartheid in South Africa with no genetic history of having an admixture of South African ancestry within their makeup. Um, I've known people I've known people personally where two what we would consider white European parents had a child that we would consider uh, black, right, or of African descent, with no distinguishable genetics from Africa within their family line, or within their DNA. And they had to do DNA testing to get to the knowledge that it was absolutely their child, right? Because the man is going, yeah, that's not my baby. And she's going, fuck, I didn't fuck anybody else, right? Like, so it absolutely has that possibility and capability. We think that that skin tone indicates our genetic makeup, and skin tone doesn't indicate our genetic makeup. Skin tone indicates a couple generations of our ancestors sometimes, but not always. Many of us have seen somebody who has a black parent and a white parent, or what we would categorize as a black parent and a white parent, and they're white, or what we would categorize as white, and their parent is dark, right? We have to end this concept that skin tone is an indicator of anything except for the racism you experience or the racism you give. Race has been debunked. Race does not exist. Racism exists. Many countries are founded on it. Many countries enact racism every single day. Race does not exist. Race is something that was created by my field, archaeology and anthropology, and is debunked by my field, archaeology and anthropology. And the way that this was debunked was because of the Whole Genome Project. When we took a look at the whole genome of people across the globe, we found that there's more genetic difference within a primary population than there is between primary populations, meaning that you are more genetically different from your next door neighbor within a primary population than you are from somebody in an entirely different part of the globe, which makes perfect sense if you think about it logically, because of the fact that inbreeding kills us as a species. It creates mutations, it creates issues, it creates problems. And so you have to have the genetic differences within your population to be able to not inbreed. Race is the thought process and the theory that this color of a person's skin or the texture of their hair or the diameter, thickness, range of other features of their bodies makes up their intelligence, makes up whether or not they can feel pain, makes up whether or not they can play sports or can do work, or whether or not they should, right? That's what race is. Race states that a superficial thing makes up the interior. And none of those things are true. And yes, race is something that we all unfortunately live under the concept and the ideology of today. Again, because old white European men were trying to justify the atrocity that they had been committing for hundreds of years. And when they could no longer justify it using their Bible and their God, they had to find another way to justify it. And so when the theory of evolution and the understanding that God didn't create us, that we evolved like the other species comes into play, they needed to find a new way. This is also where out of Africa theory has been debunked, and yet there is still the knowledge that we all developed as Homo sapiens within Africa. The theory of out of Africa has been debunked because the theory of out of Africa stated that everybody outside of Africa had left Africa 150,000 years ago and therefore had pretty much speciated in their adaptations to these places in isolation for 150,000 years. And we know that that's patently wrong. It's been debunked. There's no evidence for that, and all evidence is to the contrary. Homo sapien starts moving out of Africa proper, or what we consider to be Africa today, which was not out of Africa at the time, because of the fact that the sea levels meant that the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant area, all the way up to the Caucasus Mountains, was absolutely still a part of the continent of Africa. My website is right there. This is not a website where I publish my own things. This is a website where I've compiled bibliographies. English, I'm not going to be able to say it. I've compiled lists of sources under tabs on that website so that you can find lists of sources. And some of those sources are from mainstream articles because of the fact that you can access them. Some of those sources are sources that I believe that you can access without having to have access to a paywall. Yet you might not be able to, just because of that paywall that comes up on a lot of things. And sometimes I can access things with my credentials that other people can't access. I do this because I'm trying to teach information that I believe that everybody should have as common knowledge, that I have been taught and that I have learned over the course of several decades of study. And in trying to teach that information, I don't believe everybody should have to pay for access. Oh, awesome. Thank you. I don't believe that anybody should have to pay for access to education. It should be gate kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall, and it should not be gate kept behind language that is hard to parse, even for people who have extensive degrees. So I'm here in an act of love, trying to ensure that people have education. So the website is just a compile of sources that I try to give people access to the newer things, not some of the older knowledge I have, because I couldn't find those sources if I tried. Some of it's 30 years old, 40 years old. Some of the newer things that I'm bringing in, and in the newer information that I'm bringing in. And I am not trying to teach you everything. So you're going to have to take those articles as a starting point. There might be one or two articles on any one of the subjects, and you're going to have to use those articles as a starting point, because there's also the element of I want you to learn on your own, because when we learn things on our own, we understand them more. It broadens the pathways in our brain and it creates an understanding. And when we're questioning things, that is when we really start to learn, right? So, everything I state, well, anything that I state is new and that I have articles on is going to be on that website. Some things I state are literally 20, 30 years old, and I couldn't tell you all the names of all the books I was reading at the time and how I compiled and put together that information. I learned to read an archaeological text at 5 years old, living off-grid in backwoods with a dirt floor in a teepee. And so my education started very young at a very high level. And Lord knows I wasn't keeping sources. So, right. All of that said, Google is your friend, though I would use Google with responsibility. Go to Google Scholar, or look at the articles and see if they reference other articles and they reference scholarly journals or they reference actual scholars. If you're looking at an article from CNN and they talk about this professor says this, they're going to have a link at the bottom so you can access or link even within. Like it might, this professor says this in this article, and you can click on the article and it'll take you to the article, which will be a published scholarly journal article, or they'll have a list at the bottom. And you should absolutely always go and double down on those and get more information. Don't just take the surface information that you're getting. And while I absolutely want you to hear me, I absolutely want you to actually find information on your own, because the more information we find on our own, the more we dig into subjects, the more we're passionate about subjects, the more we rabbit hole on subjects, the better we understand those subjects. If I'm not reading books straight out of the Vatican or the classified CIA info, your info is BS. So you're telling me that if I'm not meeting the standards set by a government that's trying to control me, impossible standards, that obviously I'm lying. I just want you to sit with that thought process for a second. If I can't meet with the government that we all know is trying to hide shit from us, if I don't have access to their shit, then obviously I don't know nothing. And it's an impossible standard. Just, I just want you to sit with that thought process for a second. There's also the thought process that I'd like to introduce you to, that academia glorifies people not living, but actually just sitting around in their thoughts and not actually understanding what people are experiencing. And then it really glorifies being able to trace everything back 3,000-4,000 years to some ancient Greek philosopher who didn't have access to most of the information we have. And if you can't trace these things back, then there's faulty logic within them. Instead of supporting the scientific thought process of I observe in nature and I have an idea or hypothesis of what that thinks or what that is, and then I predict what that means and test it. Because academia doesn't usually test a lot, right? Unless it is the scientific branch. And when we're looking at whether or not I can source something from something that can source something, that can source something, that can source something, we're looking at something that becomes as inbred as the Habsburg jaw. When we have to source our sources to our sources to our sources, and we are completely unable to look at outside thought process and outside knowledge, we are narrowing our scope and we are narrowing our understanding of the world and narrowing our understanding, period. And most of academia ignores any source outside itself. Not listening to indigenous elders about the history of their space, not listening to the people who were conquered in any space, not listening to the earth itself, right? Not reading the earth itself, right? So when we only are able to reference each other and our field of vision and our understanding narrows, nothing new comes out of it, does it? And I would like to propose to you that biologically, the three things that humanity is, that Homo sapien is, all of us, every single one of us, is nurturing, communal, and curious. These are the things that we see really within, we see things that are unique within us that show that we must have these things to be human, like to subsist and continue our species. And because we must have these things to subsist and continue our species, then this means that without them, the toxicity that enters within us it causes problems within our species. So when creativity is one of the things, and by creativity, I would like to point out that we are the only species on the planet that adapts its adaptations. A lot of people are like, well, what is it that our species does that is unique? In philosophy and in things like that, that's a constant conversation. What is it that our species does that is unique? What makes us best? Because we have to be the best for some fucking reason. What makes us best? Well, one of the things that makes us unique is we adapt our adaptations. Every creature on this planet adapts things. They adapt a burrow for a home. They create a dam for a den, right? Every creature on this planet, every being, this includes the trees and the grass, which adapt the environment around them and help the environment around them. Everything on this world, in this world, adapts things. It's part of why it's here. We take the adaptations that we make and we adapt them further. A beaver creates a dam, it's his home. He's got beautiful adaptations within it. He's got a refrigerator system within it. The beaver has a great adaptation for his home, yet the beaver's home is the beaver's home that he's had throughout his time. He hasn't adapted the adaptation. We have taken that adaptation of our home and adapted it and adapted it and adapted it. Corvids can make tools. They can string together straws and different sticks and things like that to create a tool to get to things, right? Yet we could take that tool and understand that if we add this graspy thing at the end of that tool, it's going to grasp it easier, right? We took the first flint knap tool, which wasn't even created by humans, because it wasn't even created by Homo habilis. It was created by Paranthropus boisei, Paranthropus not being a Homo genus, so not even humans. We took that first tool and we adapted it further. We had actually gotten it adapted already by Homo erectus, because Homo erectus did adapt their adaptations, which is one of the things that indicates human, Homo, is adapting the adaptations in the world around you. So we adapt our adaptations. We are curious. And when we narrow our mind, when we narrow our perception, when we only get feedback that confirms us, right, instead of feedback that challenges us, it's very common knowledge that that's harmful. On every level, we talk about the fact that, what is it they call it? They have a specific word for when somebody's just a sounding board. We know that bosses who are yes men is a problem, because if all he's ever saying to you is yes and it never fucking gets done, that's a problem, right? We know that people who only confirm our biases is not a healthy situation. We know that we must be challenged in that confirmation of bias. So why do we buy into the thought process that academia, which only confirms its biases over and over and over again, and doesn't look outside of its confirmation bias into something new? Why do we somehow think that that's something we should be holding on to? That confirmation bias should constantly be there, right? That they should only be looking to each other instead of outside for information. So, no. I want you to dig in and I want you to learn. I want you to learn, though, from more than Google sources. I want you, if what you're trying to learn has people who are actively in the skill in your area, to go and listen, right? If you're trying to learn indigenous knowledge, you best be doing it at the feet of indigenous elders and culture keepers. There's no other way to learn that, right? So, and by indigenous, I'm not just talking about Turtle Island and Abayalian indigenous. I'm talking about Sami, okay? I'm talking about the Amazigh. I'm talking about the Ainu, right? There are many indigenous cultures around this globe, some fighting for recognition as indigenous cultures, like the Kumri, right? We have many indigenous cultures across the globe who deserve to be heard, and you should be listening to them over academia any day of the week, right? So I don't do a whole lot of books anymore unless it's a book that just really captures my interest. Ones that I have that capture my interest aren't really on evolution. I do have some like textbooks on evolution, which is what I've gotten from my evolution. Yet, like I was saying earlier, we discovered this last year that we in Homo erectus come around. We evolved through speciation due to convergence, which we had thought up until this year was a theoretical method of speciation. And we just proved through us and through Homo erectus that it's actually how we came about. So it's no longer theoretical. And the books that I have are a couple of years old, so they're not even going to have that knowledge. For me, I don't use books so much anymore as I just go and do article searches. And I do that within Google Scholar. Some of them are hard to access, even for me. I mean, I don't have credentials to everything. I don't have credentials to a lot of things. So some of that can be a little bit harder. Yet I also find that anything that you're going to find that's been published is very likely to be outdated by a couple of years, at least by the time of the publication, especially how swiftly and how fast everything is moving currently. Currently, our understanding of our way of speciation, currently, our understanding of our migration across the planet, currently, our understanding of everything is like this new subject every month. 3 weeks ago, we found a new species of human that came about. That the one that we have found so far is at 300,000 years ago in East Asia, in China, HLD6, a totally new species of human. I can't remember the other species of human that lived in the same cave, but I believe it's like Erectus. It might be some of the Erectus subspecies like Heidelbergensis, but I can't remember. But an entirely new species of human living, at 300,000 years ago in East Eurasia. So, and that's 3 weeks old. That knowledge is 3 weeks old. That's the publication's 3 weeks old, right? So our understanding, and in the last year, we have identified new species within us, identified more ghost species, identified a new way of our evolution, identified a whole new timeline of our evolution, identified that Homo species are not the first creators of stone tools, but Paranthropus boisei is the first creator of stone tools, identified that the oldest upright walking, the oldest hominine is 7 million years ago from a lake bed in Chad, identified that there is kind of a missing link in Greece, and identified that the first ancestor, the first Asian, and this is like within the last 2 weeks, identified that the current oldest is it last link between us and the great apes actually is coming from Asia. So like we have identified like so many different things within the last year that any publication or any book that you're reading is so far out of date by the time you're reading it. It's just not even working. So convergence or speciation through convergence. Because convergence is not speciation through convergence. There are two different things there. We can converge. We converged with Neanderthals. We converged with Denisovan. We have 5 ghost species within our DNA. So we converged with a total of 7 species. And yet that is not speciation through convergence because no new species developed out of them. So when and academia has become religion, hasn't it? Right? It's really a big part of that. So what we're talking about today is all the different species within us. So the oldest human species, the word human in Latin is homo. So the genus homo indicates a species that is human. So just so that I can clarify for anybody who isn't aware. So anything that has the genus of Homo, like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo antecessor, Homo neanderthal, Homo denisovan, Homo sapiens sapien, anything that has the genus of Homo is a human species. The oldest human that we have is Homo habilis, and this is 3.3 million years ago, and this is in Africa. I know that we have Homo habilis along the Nile. Uh, I do not know where the earliest Homo habilis is found within Africa, but the oldest, the first human that we have is Homo habilis in Africa. And I'm pretty sure they were all over Africa. Um, hmm. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, so we've always thought that Homo habilis developed the Oldowan-Tool complex, and we have found the Oldowan-Tool complex along the banks of the Nile, and so we believe that that was Homo habilis along the banks of the Nile. The fossil findings of Homo habilis is in Kenya and Tanzania, in particular at Lake Turkana, Olduvai Gorge, and Kobafora. And then I know that we have, we have evidence of Oldowan tools along the Nile, but knowing that Paranthropus boisei is who created the Oldowan tool complex, that might change that up. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that changes it up because it is so recent. So I would have to go back and do a little bit of digging to see if that actually changes it up. I don't usually talk about Homo habilis a whole lot anyways, but they are in Africa and they are the oldest human that we have. And pardon me, baby, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kick your head. My puppy's underneath my feet. We have the oldest so Saleo because she can't spell that worth a whole lot of help. Let me see. Got to not do it. Okay. So Coeluanthropithecus tedici is the oldest known species of the human family tree. So what this means is by the time that it becomes the human family tree, this is already within Africa. And this is 7 million years ago in West Central Africa and Chad. This is the oldest evidence of a human-like species. There is some other, it says some of the oldest, if you're looking at something like the Smithsonian. I do know that we have, like I was stating, at the same time period, we have evidence of footprints in Crete that show upright walking, show the structure of foot for upright walking. And that's 7 million years ago in Crete. And then we have evidence of, we have a jawbone from what we think might be a common ancestor between us and chimpanzees. And what I was saying with the one that's only 2 weeks old, I haven't dug into it. So that's a new thought process that is coming out, that there is an evidence of an ancestor that is a common ancestor between us and the great apes. So this wouldn't be to the point of our upright walking. It wouldn't be to the point of somebody that we would identify necessarily as that first of our ancestors. It would be somebody that we would identify as being like us and like the great apes, more great ape like. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at something that's 8 million years old. So we're looking at something that is like 7.7 million years before we came about. Numbers are not my thing. 7.7 million years before sapien comes about, and like 4.7 3.7 million years, 4 million years before the first Homo species comes about. With dating on species, sometimes the dating you'll see different sites and different articles will tell you different datings. So like there is some dating that puts Homo habilis around 3 million and some dating that puts Homo habilis around 2 million, right? So when we're looking at that, this is because of the way that the dating techniques are. This is also, a lot of times dating is changing on them, right? That family species again. I was talking about Homo habilis, which is the oldest human. Sahelanthropus todensis. I have not listened the way this is pronounced, so I don't know. Is that oldest in the lake bed in Chad. And then the missing link one, I don't think I mentioned their name, but the missing link one, or the possible missing link one, is called fuck off, Sarah's. Sorry, I had it. Africanus something or another, but I can't remember the rest of it or the other part of it. So absolutely, Nicole. So when we're looking at these different thought processes and looking at our timeline, the ability for us to become who we are really comes from growing up as species in Africa, right? Not even just sapien, but just to get to the point of actually walking and actually interacting and the way that we do as an upright hominin, right? So this comes from growing in Africa as an evolutionary standpoint, right? We do really all come from that space. So when we look at Homo erectus making it out, we see that Homo erectus makes it out of Africa at like 1.8 million years ago. Homo erectus is like 2 million years old. And Homo erectus is out of Africa within a couple 100,000 years. And when Homo erectus makes it out of Africa, makes it out in groups, and those groups go to different spaces. And it continues to go, right? Some of those groups have already kind of speciated. Some of those groups speciate and then speciate and then speciate in those areas. Some of those groups only speciate in specific areas and don't speciate in other areas. Homo erectus, part of paleoanthropology will put Homo erectus with several subspecies. And then part of the paleoanthropology will put Homo erectus as a member of multiple species. There's all sorts of different species at this time. Now, before I was in the group that put it with subspecies, and I'm not sure where I'm at now because this understanding of speciation through convergence lends knowledge to this, but also lends knowledge to this. So the understanding now is that the speciation through convergence happens for us and happens for Homo erectus. And when we look at this, what we're looking at is the fact that these finds show several different morphologies of skeletal morphology within one encampment. So say you have a landslide and you have 8 individuals in this landslide, you might have 2 that are heidelbergensis, 2 that are erectus, 2 that are rudolfensis, and 2 that are antecessor, right? You have several different groups within this. So the thought process over here is that they're subspecies. And the thought process over here is that they're multiple species. Now, this could be multiple species living in bands, or it could be subspecies living in bands. Our current understanding, or within the last year, is the idea that Homo erectus itself comes out of something like this with Paranthropus boisei, Australopithecus, which is Lucy, and Homo heidelbergensis, and that it is a mixture of these groups living together. Thank you so much, Tess. It is a mixture of these groups living together that gives the advent of erectus. Therefore, erectus comes out of convergence of many different species, and a new species is created. This is why we think that the morphology within different subspecies of erectus is there. They could just all be different species as well with different morphology. We have not DNA tested any of them. We can't get DNA from any of them because of the time and the way DNA degrades and where they're at. So the understanding that comes along with this is that they make it across the globe, and literally across the globe. We have evidence in Turtle Island, which is North America. We have evidence in Australia. We have evidence in, well, all over Eurasia, right? So, and then we have evidence in the islands in the South Pacific. So, because we have fossil evidence, not fossils in all of these spaces, the evidence in Turtle Island is at the San Diego Natural History Museum, and it is the Cerruti mastodon find, which is stone tools among bones, juvenile mastodon bones that are obviously broken at time of death. And that's 130,000 years ago. And then the evidence in Australia is the Moy Hill site, and it is fire cracked rock and food items with fire burned to them along, I think it's like a beach almost within Australia. It's the Moy Hill site. Um, when we're looking at that, we see that this is Homo erectus making it to these spaces. We know that Homo erectus, or one of the species of Homo erectus, make it to the island of Flores in Indonesia. You had to cross water to get to that island at any point during the entire timeline of the Earth because of the way that the tectonic plates are, and the deepness of the trench that is in that. We call this the Wallace Trench, the Wallace Line. It's never been above water line. The land masses within it have never been above water line because of the fact that it's so deep. So when we are, and then the island of Luzon in the South Pacific for Homo luzonensis within the last couple of years, this one you had to cross the Wallace Trench to get to. So we show evidence of Homo erectus making across the globe and speciating in many different spaces across the globe. This supports multi-regional speciation or multi-regional theory. In each of these spaces where Homo erectus speciates in groups that are smaller groups. And the reason is because you see Homo erectus moving into the space, and Homo erectus is still kind of moving back and forth a little bit. The idea that we aren't constantly moving is really weird. We've always moved, right? So because we've always moved, there's absolutely evidence of movement within this. Yet we see that the space within Western Eurasia develops first Heidelbergensis, which we also see within Africa, and antecessors there as well, which we also see within Africa. It's uncertain if it's Homo erectus's movement outside of this space that develops these species within Western Eurasia, and then those species move into Africa, or if those species are moving with Homo erectus in later migrations out of Africa, because Homo heidelbergensis itself is seen in Africa. It is not as early as the first movement of Homo erectus outside of Africa. So we see that the heidelbergensis and antecessor end up speciating into, and I think that the understanding is, and sometimes this is shifted, so I'm not exactly sure what the current is heidelbergensis to antecessor to Neanderthal. And it's also thought that Denisovan might either be antecessor to Denisovan or antecessor and Neanderthal to Denisovan. But we're not exactly sure because all of that stuff is still kind of like out here as they're trying to trace it. So when we look in Western Eurasia, we get to Neanderthal. When we get to Eastern Eurasia, we get to Denisovan, mainly through that same kind of movement. You see it's ergaster mainly, an antecessor, and some Heidelbergensis, I think, that make it into Western Eurasia. We also see that the new species that they just came out with is within Western Eurasia. I don't know if we've got DNA or anything else off of that species yet. So I doubt we do yet. We'll see if we do get some, and whether or not it tells us the other species or any information. So, but we see that species is with some other species as well. I believe it was Heidelbergensis, Neanderthal, and Erectus, but I'm not exactly sure. Again, it's relatively new, and so I have to read it a few times. So when we are watching this movement across and this speciation into these other species across, we currently have 6 species that we have in the fossil record. Neanderthal, and this is in the order in which you find them. Neanderthal in Germany, Neander Valley. We have Homo forensis next in the Isle of Flores in Indonesia. We have Homo denisova in the Denisovan cave in Russia. We have Homo naledi in the Rising Star Cave in South Africa. We have Homo longi in China. And we have Homo luzonensis in the island of Luzon in the South Pacific. And then the brand new one, HLD6, that does not have a name yet, in a cave in China as well. Homo longi, we're not sure yet whether or not Homo longi is Denisovan or a whole new species. This is because Longi's skull has been around for a while. We do not have a skull of Denisovan, and we have not gotten DNA from the skull of Longi. They just decided that it was its own new species last year, the year before, and it was very much about the markers on the skull. But because we don't have anything else other than the skull, and we don't have DNA, and we don't have a skull cap of Denisovan, but we do have DNA, we're not sure if they correlate. They may, or it could be an entirely new species. And we will only find that out if we find a skull that shows similar markings and get DNA from it, or find a Denisovan skull and get DNA from it. Yeah, well, and there is also so the understanding that I've had was that Homo antecessor is basically the last common ancestor between us. It goes like Heidelbergensis and then antecessor. I do not know if that has changed real recently, and that's what you're saying or not. And it's very possible that it has, right? So I'm not going to, I'm going to say this is what I've known, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is what it is, right? Just because currently everything is changing, which is what I love about my field, right? It's not why I went into my field. I went into my field to ensure that it made some changes that it needed to make, and because I have passion for it and always have. Yet it's absolutely, it needs to be changing in a lot of levels. So having these new understandings and the way it shifts with the new understandings is really cool. So what we see within us, which is what we're talking about today, the other species that we see within us are all descendant species of Homo erectus making it across, or the different subspecies or the different species of Homo that we correlate with Homo erectus making it across the globe, or descendant species of Homo erectus making it across the globe. When we see that these species are making it across the globe, what we're seeing is that they have what we call speciation through isolation for the most part. And in that speciation through isolation, we don't have a whole lot of genetic evidence of all of them. And we only really have genetic evidence of a couple of them so far. And because we don't have genetic evidence of all of them, we can't really tell things like population sizes. We can tell population sizes based on our finds or what was right there at that time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the entirety of the population size. What we've seen with Neanderthal is that there are two almost extinction events, like two near extinction events through the course of Neanderthal's timeline. This is something that we're seeing through DNA. We're also seeing with Neanderthal that Neanderthal doesn't seem to have a Y DNA of its own. Whether this means that the male half of their conception had an X gene, Y gene, or chromosome. Y chromosome is a degraded X chromosome, so it's possible. Or whether it means that, and we just aren't reading it right because it looks differently for them, or whether this means that they had a Y chromosome and that the Y chromosome was replaced early on, we're not sure. It does look like the 3 or 4 Neanderthals with Y chromosomes that we have, that the oldest ones that we have show Denisovan Y DNA, and that the more recent ones that we have show sapien Y DNA. So because of this, it's not sure what the presence of the Y DNA that they had was, or why yet. We're working on it, right? When we're looking at them, by the time we really start to come in contact with them, the current understanding is, with current understanding, the understanding 2 years ago, and it may have changed when we pushed back our timeline, but I haven't seen a shift in the understanding based on genetics. The understanding of the Neanderthal species population whole, the amount they were during the whole time of their species as a whole genetic genome, right, was 500,000 as a species whole. Now, when we're looking at the shift of their timeline, I'm not sure yet where it's changing, right? But as we're looking at that shift in understanding, and as we're looking at the way that we're looking at Neanderthal and we're looking at the genetics within Neanderthal, we're seeing things like they're extremely inbred by the time that they're starting to meet up with us. So their population is extremely small and their population is extremely inbred by the time they're starting to meet up with us. So when they meet up with us, just like it seems when they meet up with Denisovan, they're basically searching for stray genetics, right? They're basically looking for anything to stop the inbreeding, right? And so we kind of envelop them within us. And in that enveloping them within us, there's actually more Neanderthal DNA on the planet. More Neanderthal DNA on the planet today than there was during the time of their whole genome, during their entirety as a species, which really means that Neanderthal has lived on. The idea that Neanderthal went extinct is rather false, actually. First, Neanderthal was here for 600,000 years as a whole genome, and they were like 300,000 years by the time we came onto the scene. So they have they've doubled our current lifespan as a species. And secondly, because we can see so much of them within our species, we can see that they have lived on as a species. We can see Neanderthal DNA in everyone across the planet pre-colonization, except for two populations within Africa. The two populations within Africa are the Kwe people of South Africa and the Yoruba people of West Africa. Geographically, I'm hard sometimes. But the Yoruba people of West Africa and the Kwe people of South Africa are the two populations that do not have Neanderthal DNA. Everybody else in Africa has between 1% to 2% Neanderthal DNA in pre-colonized finds. That's the same percentage as most of Western Eurasia. You get higher percentages of Neanderthal DNA in Eastern Eurasia. People in Australia and the islands of the South Pacific have Neanderthal DNA, and people in Turtle Island and Abiyala have Neanderthal DNA. So the two populations that don't have Neanderthal DNA that are in Africa have ghost species within them. They have 3 ghost species within them. Ghost species are species that we see just a tiny hair of the species within our DNA, kind of like a percentage, like we can see like a couple of strands, 2%, 1% Neanderthal DNA. We can see something like that within our DNA. And it's obviously terrestrial, it's obviously human, yet it is a DNA that we haven't found the full genome of in the fossil record. So we don't know what species of human it was. And so we have 3 ghost species in the 2 spaces in Africa, or the 2 communities in Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA. Hey, Rebel. So when we're looking at other species, again, we see Neanderthal everywhere across the globe except for those 2 spaces in Africa, the Yoruba people of West Africa and the Kwe people of South Africa. We see Denisovan in people within Southeast Eurasia, the islands of the South Pacific, and Australia, and Turtle Island, and Abiyala. Denisovan DNA seems to, well, we find Denisova themselves in a cave in Russia so far, and that's the only place we've found them so far. Their DNA seems to be mainly in this southeastern part of the continent of Eurasia, and then outside, down and out and over. This, as I was stating earlier, is one of the reasons that they're currently looking at a southern boat route for the populating of Abiyala and Turtle Island. And it's also one of the ways that they can trace the timeline of the migration and the time taken in the migration pattern for Abiyalians and Turtle Island indigenous people to get here. So the Denisovan DNA ranges anywhere from the 0.02 to 0.03% that we see within Denisovan, or within Abiyalians and Turtle Islanders, and it goes up to about 6% within both Indigenous Australians, 5 to 6% within Indigenous Australians, and 5 to 6% within New Guineans. And then maybe it's Papuans, because I know it's not Papua New Guinea itself, but it's island within that space. And I can't remember which exact island. And those are the 2 highest spaces of Denisovan DNA. Again, the highest presence of Neanderthal DNA is in Western Eurasia. The next DNAs that we see outside of those, again, we see the 3 ghost species within the 2 species within Africa. We also see within Indigenous Australians a ghost species. And the ghost species within Indigenous Australians, to me, relates to the Moy site that we see in Australia that's 120,000 years old. And then we also see a ghost species within Indigenous Abayalians and Indigenous Turtle Islanders. And this one is related to the Cerruti Mastodon site, to me, at 130,000 years old. So when we're seeing Homo erectus making it across the globe, we're seeing that every space that Homo erectus populates, that Homo sapien then comes in contact with the descendant species as they move across the globe. Instead of evidence of violence, what we see is evidence of admixture. We see evidence of living together. Now, when we look at the fact that we and erectus come out of a convergence of many different species coming together, we can see that in our birth, we were very much living in communities of many different species. And so seeing people who look kind of like us, but not quite like us, was really typical. It was very much a part of who we were. We might have an ancestor or erectus or gaster grandmother, right? We might have somebody who looked completely different than us as a parent. In fact, several of us would have had parents who looked absolutely nothing like us as we become the 4 or 5 people within a broad band of many different species, and we're the only ones with flat faces and a chin, right? So as we are seeing this, we were the unusual when we start, just like erectus was the unusual when it starts. And because we were the unusual when we start, the unusual becomes usual, right? Because everybody seemed different. Different was similarity, right? We don't focus on what the difference is. We focus on what it is that we're all doing the same, which is supporting each other as a community, which is providing for each other, which is upright walking and having fire and wearing clothes, which nothing else is doing, right? So we see with this that there is this movement across the globe of our species that involves enveloping everybody else within us as we move across the globe. There's a lot of thought process that we must have caused extinction of these other species, yet there is no evidence that we caused extinction of any other species of human. I mean, there's plenty of evidence currently that we're causing extinction of all sorts of species. There is no evidence that we cause the extinction of any other species of human. There is, in fact, way more evidence that instead of causing their extinction, we were able to be their continuation, which I think is an important and valid thing to understand and look at. We want to think of ourselves as being these locusts. We want to think of ourselves as being what we are currently, which is pretty traumatic to the planet, because currently what we are is pretty traumatic to the planet. And we are currently absolutely pretty traumatic as a planet to the planet. Yet we must understand that just because this is who we are currently does not mean that this is who we have been the whole time. Because we are curious, because we experiment, because we are at heart scientists and have been since we were Homo erectus, we absolutely have this tendency to experiment. We have this tendency to find new ways of doing things, right? And not even tendency, it's just really a part of who we are. And because we have this part of this us that must absolutely find new ways to do things every time we turn around, we're constantly experimenting with a new way. We are currently living in the middle of what I think is a roughly 10,000-year-old experiment that's gone wrong. It went wrong in its very first inceptions. Very first cities based on stratification and agriculture caused climate destruction in Gazal. Our very first cities based on stratification that we've read about show othering, show deification of narcissism, thank you so much, show huge problems within the creation of stratification, right? Within this creation of this idea that instead of taking care of every member of community on an equal level, we must take care of certain members of community more than we take care of other members of community, right? That it is not about taking care of those who are disadvantaged, but taking care of those who are advantaged. That certain people deserve to be worshiped or adulated, right? And not based on what they're providing for everybody, but based on what they're providing for themselves. So when we're looking at this, we're seeing that prior to this advent and prior to this understanding or thought process, we do have this very experimental, very communal, very global, very nurturing and intersectional thought process. And it is this very nurturing and intersectional thought process that really gives us the advancements that we have. And they show that when Neanderthal and Homo sapien met in the Levant area, in the Arabian Peninsula, which at the time was absolutely still a part of Africa because of the glaciation. When we see that these two species of humans are meeting, we see that they're living in two caves, a 5-minute walk from each other, for 100,000 years in this space. That they change their tool usage, that they change many of the different things about themselves, that they enter into new understandings. It is during the time period of the connection of our two species that we start to see the development of the burial of our dead, that we start to see the development of understanding of identity, of having an id, of having a conscious, like of being conscious of self, being conscious of our own existence, and that we start to understand a concept of having identity itself, as in identifying ourselves based on the groups that we belong to, or identifying ourselves based on the way that we decorate our bodies. Through cave art, through burials, through these different things that we have, such as, do you see piercings buried with somebody? Do you see tools buried with somebody, right? Based our ochre buried with somebody. Haha, I got it right. I didn't say ochre. Do you see these things buried with different peoples? And based on these based on these evidences, we can see this development of who we are today. And this development of who we are today absolutely comes about when we start coming into contact with species that we didn't grow up with. Yet we never seem to see these species as somebody to harm, and we never seem to see these species as somebody to have it out with. There is very scant evidence of anything that could possibly be attributed to violence before 10,000 years ago in the archaeological record. And we see that there are people out there who will take things that could possibly be attributed to violence, and they decide that they are absolutely evidence of violence, and then they mean that we killed the Neanderthals. When you look at the evidence provided is not definitive violence, and it is certainly not definitive violence between species. So when we look at this, we can see that there is mountains of evidence of commingling, mountains of evidence of interaction, mountains of evidence of benefit from commingling and interaction. And there is very little evidence there is no evidence that is definitive, and very little evidence of even possible levels of violence. So when we're looking at this movement across the globe, and we're looking at this admixture that we're getting in all of these different spaces as we leave this area within the Arabian Peninsula and within the Levant area at roughly 50,000 years ago. Though we know that people are making it out before, not people, sapien are making it out before then. We have a couple of finds. I think that the oldest one that we have that is outside of the African continent is about 130,000 years ago. It looks, all the morphology is sapien, and yet we do not believe it's somebody whose genetic line continued into us. Like, we believe it's a different line of sapien. The same thing with the recent one that's 80,000 years old in China. It is believed that it is not the ancestor of the current sapiens that are currently about. So when we are looking at that movement out, we're seeing that as they create that movement out, they are coming in contact with the ghost species that we see within them and with the other species that we see genetically within them, Homo denisovan. And there is not a whole lot of evidence of them coming in contact with Homo florensis or luzonensis until later on. There are reports of sightings of Homo luzonensis as recently as 50 years ago among the indigenous population on the island of Flores in Indonesia. Yet we're not sure. There's somebody studying that, whether or not actually Homo florensis still exists. So we do have reports from indigenous people, I believe in Luzon as well, of smaller creatures or smaller humans that lived in that space when they arrived. I would like to point out that, the possibility that there are still other human beings living on this planet is absolutely there. There have been sightings of other hominins for generations in indigenous groups, right? So it is absolutely there as a possibility, right? Most things are possible, right? Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that, Fable. That was like every time I logged in. And I stop logging in when I have somebody just yelling at me in my comments. I'm like, yeah, I can't even handle you. Like, bye. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that it was taken care of. That was really weird. So when we're looking at the different movements across, we see that we are coming in contact with some, but the only ones that we have, the only ones that we have the actual intermixed evidence of, or that we can actually see evidence of. We don't even really see evidence in the fossil record of coming in contact with a lot of other species, but the ones that we can see evidence of us coming in contact with are Neanderthal and Denisovan, and then the ghost species that we have within us, which is currently 5. When we're seeing us come in contact with those 7 other species, we do see evidence of us living together in caves of Neanderthals. We see fossilized evidence of that. And we do see possibility of evidence of us living together in Denisova Cave with Denisovan, though not necessarily with Neanderthal, because the evidence of us in Denisova Cave, I think, is 28,000 years ago. And by that time, well, Denisova is still around. Neanderthal is thought to have been dead for roughly 2,000 years as a species whole. That doesn't mean that they weren't still around. They could have possibly been still around. We just haven't found fossilized evidence of them still being around. So we see that in Denisova Cave that sapien actually is intermixing with Denisovan. Current understanding of the timeline is that Neanderthal ends the most, that's not the word I want. Some put it at 40,000 years ago, and some put it at 30,000 years ago for the ending of Neanderthal. The ending of Denisovan, I have heard, so there are, most mainstream sites will put it around 30,000 years ago, yet there is a couple of published articles through scientific journals that talk about finding Denisovan fossils around 13,000 years ago. When we're looking at anybody else, they're already gone. Homo erectus is gone by 170,000 years ago. We did live with Homo erectus and antecessor and Heidelbergensis. We did live with all of these groups of human, not only in Africa, but as we're moving outside of Africa, any ones that are still there. So like the 130,000 years ago, I don't even think with that, because I do believe that the others are already gone by then. But our looking within Africa does see us living with these other groups, or these other species, up until the point that these other species end up ending as their species whole. Now, because there is this understanding that we are coming about as a convergence between many different species, and there's currently They haven't really set all the different species that they think that we've converged from. They do believe that it wasn't from species like Homo naledi that is so morphologically different from us in their skeletal structure. Yet I would think that because we're coming into being, the thought process is that we start roughly 300,000 years ago. The oldest that we have is in Morocco at 300,000 years old. There is evidence shortly after that of sapien in a couple other parts in Africa, and that's why there's this idea that we're coming about through being in children of bands of people, and that we're coming about in a couple of different spaces and then coming down and converging together later on. So with that, we were in the same space as Homo naledi while Homo naledi was there. Yet they don't believe that they converged to make us, yet their brain structure is the same as our brain structure is today. And when we start, we do not have this brain structure. Our brain structure is pretty similar to the rest of the Homo species, which means that it's more long than it is round. And in that, we believe currently that it is when it gets to this globular lobal shape, is what we call it, is when we get to this intelligence level. We also thought it had to do with the big size of our brains, but when we look at Homo naledi, we see that Homo naledi has the shape of our brains now, but their brain sizes are small. So their brain size, brain cases are the same size roughly as Lucy, as Australopithecines, and yet the shape is sapien sapien. That's awesome. That's amazing. My professor of paleoanthropology was invited to go, but she had a newborn at the time and she couldn't. She's extremely small, and that's why they invited her. When we are looking at this, because if we're looking at the more recent knowledge that Lee Berger has put out, we're seeing that there is a hashtag that we see within Homo naledi's cave art, because Homo naledi actually has cave art, right? This hashtag that we see for Homo naledi's cave art is something that we actually see within Neanderthal and Denisovan as well. The earliest cave art or cave called, not Denisovan, sorry, Neanderthal and sapien as well. The earliest cave art and cave carvings that we see within sapien and Neanderthal also have hash marks or hashtags within them, right? And so in my wondering about some of the things, right, I wonder if it is us coming into being and seeing that around us at the same time that naledi is there, whether or not we actually intermixed with them or they were a part of our speciation, doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't contribute to our knowledge, contribute to our memory. And so maybe it's 100,000 years later that we're remembering the hash mark that we saw in the caves in South Africa, and we're first carving it on the walls in East Eurasia, I think is what West Eurasia, I think. So when we're looking at that, we can see that there's probably some understanding gained from naledi. Well, we may not have gained genetics from naledi. We'll probably never find DNA from naledi because of the fact that naledi is in an extremely hot environment, but it is also an extremely wet environment. If something is really hot and arid, it can maintain things a little bit longer, though it's still not the best environment. Cold and arid or cold and dry and submerged in alkaline, I think is what it is, water, fully submerged are the best environments for maintaining and preserving DNA or pretty much any genetic material. So when we're looking at this evidence of ghost species within South Africa and within West Africa, there's no thought process or belief that naledi would have been one of those ghost species, which means that there are also 3 other species of Homo within these spaces after 300,000 years ago that we're intermixing with. So after, and their current understanding is we start at 300,000 years ago, but we solidify between 135 and 125,000 years ago as one species. And so it is after the solidification of us as one species that we would see the introduction of DNA from another species that would actually be a clear marker instead of just becoming a part of who we are as a species whole. So when we're looking at that, um, that means that we are seeing at least 3 other species within Africa that we haven't found in the fossil record that are living after 130,000 or after 135,000 years ago, that are contributing to the DNA of groups within South Africa and contributing to the DNA of groups within what communities within West Africa. I'm trying to not say groups, I'm trying to say communities because it is a much better term. And I am still like, I have groups within my head for some reason, and it goes to that, and I'm trying to change it up. So these are the different species that we have found within our DNA and that we have found within the fossil record, as well as the ones that we have found in both. Again, because the subject is currently changing so much, there might be things that I thought today that might change tomorrow. If I find them, I will let you know and I'll change them up. So what are they moving towards ghost species as being then? Because I haven't seen anything talking about that. The latest articles that I saw talking about ghost species and using that terminology were like 2 weeks ago. So yeah, I'll take a look. I mean, it makes sense. I don't think there's going to be, like, I'm not sure if we'll ever discover them. That doesn't make sense to me. I think that we converge with them just like we converge with others. But I also am a very firm believer and try to make sure that I point out all the time that because we are admixture are us, like because admixture is everything we do, there is really no evidence or thought process that we can rate our different admixtures as being different species or different races or different ethnicities, because admixture just really is such a common thing, right? Well, and that makes sense. So when we look at like HLD6, that new one that they're looking at that just came out within the last couple of weeks, they're also talking about another ghost lineage within that. Or not that it's the same lineage, like not that that is the ghost lineage, right? When we're looking at that, they're talking about, it being a convergence of a couple different species. And if we're a convergence of the same couple of different species at the same time, but, one's in Africa and one's over there, and the understanding that, there is that kind of like intermix between, that makes sense on some levels. I mean, I would say that on other levels, it doesn't, because when we look at things like the Cerruti mastodon find and the fact that Turtle Island indigenous people have a ghost species within them, it, to me, also gives lend to that, to the indigenous histories. Many indigenous stories talk about there being another species here when they arrive, or there being, or them themselves belonging to another species. And many spaces actually talk about developing another species being around. And so when we're looking at things like that, to me, that supported multi-regional speciation of erectus speciating in many different regions into different species, and then the support of the understanding that when sapien arrives, there are other species that are coming along, meeting as they're arriving, is really important to the respect that indigenous people know their history, right, and know their own selves and know what has happened, right. So for me, when I can see archaeological evidence backing up the histories that I learned as a child and the understanding that I learned as a child, it's really important to like make sure that those are out there for that specific fact, because I'm looking at, I'm looking at the stories that I was told being proven true, and it's important to know that things that have been ignored about people are, like having somebody ignore your truth and replace it with their own can be really hard, right? So while I can see like the idea that it's a part of our evolution, right? So if it's, and let me reread this to make sure that I'm, and I do have discussion panel thought processes from time to time. I just can't typically do them because it's difficult for my mind, the way my mind works. Yeah, I see. Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, that makes total sense. Um, Yeah, I would say except for places like we haven't found the fossils like in Australia in here. But yeah, no, that makes total sense that they're well, and I personally feel that what's going to happen is that we're going to get DNA out of species that are already there and we're going to go, "Oh, ha ha ha." Right? Like that's what that was, right? Instead of it's I don't think it's undiscovered in the fossil record as much as I think that it's undiscovered in the DNA record, right? Um, Now, is it possible that there are more? I mean, we're finding new species all the time. It's absolutely possible that there are more species in the fossil record that we haven't discovered. Um, I mean, we found one 2 weeks ago, or they published it 2 weeks ago. Uh, Yet, when we're looking at it, like I absolutely think, I mean, so we know our last find of Homo erectus is like 170,000 years ago. We can get DNA back that far now. So if we find another erectus around that time period, that's possible that we're going to be able to get erectus DNA at some point, right? Um, yeah, and it's possible that like we're going to see. One, I think that. I mean, I think that when the end comes, we're going to find that it's not just 5 to 6 more, that it might only be 5 to 6 more within us, but there's probably tons of species that we haven't found within the fossil record yet of human, right? When we look at um, the different evidence that we have now, right? So they just came out, God, the articles that I've seen on it are only within the last week, and it's talking about, first of all, they reclassified Homo bodacensis or something like that, and as its own species, which has been kind of in the works for a hot minute as to whether or not it was. But then the other one was is that they realized that that the evolution of humanity, like uh, one of our ancestor species, actually hit a bottleneck at like 900,000 years old and went down to like I think they said like 1,500 of the species, right? So when we're looking at that, I think that as we're looking at the different DNA evidences, is we're coming up with so many new tools, new dating techniques, using lidar to take a look in the ground so that we don't have to disturb things before we know what's going on. All of these things, as we're doing this, getting DNA out of the soil, getting DNA out of lice, the shaft that lice leave on somebody's hair, all these different new informations and techniques that we have, I think that we're going to find so much more information. So much more information. Like I think that I think that we have barely touched the tip of the iceberg. Um, and for me, that's, I mean, compare our information today to our information 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we didn't know that there was 20 years ago, 2003 is when we found Homo florensis. Emotional. Thank you, thank you. We found Homo florensis 20 years ago. Up until that point, we only thought that we had lived around Neanderthal, and we weren't even sure if we hadn't like descended from Neanderthal yet. 5 years ago is when we found the first hyoid for Neanderthal. It might be a little bit longer. It's just 5 years ago in my head. Um, And before that, we thought Neanderthal couldn't speak. And now we know not only could Neanderthal speak, but Denisovan could speak and Erectus could speak. So, like, and by that, I want to always double down verbal communication, syllabic language, not the communication level that everything on this planet has, because we all communicate. Everybody communicates. The trees communicate with each other. They have matriarchal clans that live in vast forest nations, and they all talk to each other. All animals talk to each other. All plants not talk to each other, right? So on those different levels, communication exists, and we have to make sure that we understand that. But and when we're looking at that, it's really important to, as we're just changing our concept, as we're understanding that just because we thought it doesn't mean it's true, right? I think it's really important to take a look at all those things. It's fascinating constantly to me. Like, I am constantly just enthralled and fascinated, and constantly, like, my partner hears, "Oh my God, we found this," every couple of days. Like, "Oh my God, this came out. Oh my God, that came out. Oh my God, look at this." And I'm sure that my partner, who is not in anthropology or archaeology at all, is like, "Great, I know more about this than I ever wanted to," right? Yeah, absolutely. Well, and for me, a lot of that comes from the opening up of it to indigenous peoples, to marginalized groups. Like, when academia stopped being straight up old white men, right? Like, when we stopped making it all about being able to connect it back, when we started opening up it to broader levels, is when we get this new influx of information, which just is, to me, the fact that every time we put two boxes together, the box explodes, right? Every time you take two brains and you put them together, you come up with new ideas. I'm going to go because I just heard my partner wake up. Um, Thank you, everybody, for coming in and sitting with me today and hearing me. I will be back, I'm sure, probably over the next couple days. And may your guys' day be bright. Remember that biologically we are nurturing and communal and creative. And the fact that the vast majority of us are depressed and miserable is because we live in a society that has indoctrinated us into the idea that being nurturing and communal is wrong. And as you watch people live in horror, it is only right and healthy that a compassionate person, a person with empathy who is nurturing and communal, would hurt over that. So it is absolutely the correct response to trauma to be depressed and anxious in this late stage capitalistic nasty that you live in. And may you all hang on, because we need you and you're loved and you're needed. And that we're all worthy just by existing. I am going to take off. Welcome back, Sleepy, as I take off. Partner just woke up. I will see you guys all within the next couple days. Bye. Bye, YouTube. Have a great one.